Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence, where we will be looking at triangulation. Triangulation refers to the assessment of a particular result using multiple approaches, multiple methods, using different ways of verification to cross-examine evidence to give us greater certainty regarding whether it is right or wrong. In the field of ijtihad or juristic reasoning, scholars have found three fields at least to be most critical when it comes to the science of ijtihad and how to ensure the highest quality of juristic reasoning. The fields that guide these, most importantly, usulul fiqh, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. Second, Islamic legal maxims or Islamic legal philosophy, qawaid al-fiqhiyya, and the maqasid of Sharia, the higher intents and the articulation of the purposes and objectives of Islam. These three fields support each other in a very synergistic manner in arriving at the truth. What we'll be discussing today would be that synergy. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss this are two of our distinguished trainers and facilitators, volunteers with the Dawah Institute, Sister Salatu Suleh and Brother Ibrahim Bello. You are both most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I'd like to start with Sister Salatu. What can you say about the relationship, the synergy, the interdependence of these three fields of usulul fiqh, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, qawaid al-fiqhiyya and maqasid sharia, when it comes to the improvement of the quality of fatwas given by muftis or councils of scholars or jurists?
As we've said so many times, the three fields actually share the same root. They are anchored in the Quran and the Sunnah. And as we have shown throughout this series, that even from the actions and choices and opinions of Sahaba, that these three fields are actually connected. That's one. Another thing to also note about the three fields is that there are slight distinctions between them. For example, when it comes to the agreement between different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, when they talk about al-qawaid, that is the maxims or the principles, or they talk about al-maqasid, the higher aims and objectives of Sharia law, in principle, the madhahib have a consensus on what these principles are and what the maqasid are in principle. More so than when we look at usulul fiqh, because it is in the field of usulul fiqh, once we look beyond the Quran and the Sunnah, especially the hadith mutawatir, that we start to see differences among the madhahib. Therefore, when a position or a ruling is aligned with the maqasid, it's aligned with al-qawaid, that is the principles as well as the goals or higher intents, it's helpful in resolving differences of opinions, or it also helps scholars see the benefit and the wisdom in opinions that are different from theirs. Another thing to mention is that in as much as we have these variations and slight distinctions between the three fields, all of the fields are used to improve the quality of ijtihad, to ensure that ijtihad actually fulfills the objectives of Sharia. The way they work is, I think we can use the example of the thinking hats. The thinking hats are, it's a term used to just describe different perspectives with which to look at an idea or a problem, to manage the flow of thoughts and ideas when discussing. In a similar manner, these three fields work by helping scholars, helping students of Islamic jurisprudence look at an issue or a ruling from three different perspectives, trying to assess, to gauge, or to determine what is the best way to meet the aims of Sharia. To be more specific, Usul al-Fiqh helps us look at an issue from the point of view of what's the evidence for any ruling that exists or any ruling that will be made. What is that evidence? So it also helps with accountability, transparency, and greater trust and understanding. Al-Maqasid al-Sharia, the specific purposes, higher intents of the law, helps us look at those specific things clearly outlined and named that should be protected. While Al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya gives us the perspective of having broad principles, that whatever issue we may be dealing with, these broad principles come into play and guide us in our decision making. In this way, the three fields work together to improve the process of coming up with rulings to solve problems and answer questions that may come up or do come up from time to time.
Brother Ibrahim, what would you add to the importance and relationship between these three fields?
Usul al-Fiqh, like she mentioned earlier, is concerned with analysis of evidence and their interpretation. So basically they are looking at evidence, the interpretation and the formulas around them just to get it clear. Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya is more like a second level of assessment or filter, a simple check, and to see whether it has conformed to agreed rules in principle. Why Maqasid al-Sharia is looking at, okay, what do they serve to protect? Like the why behind all this mathematics and effort till this extent. Now, usually, in the approach used in this our course, we discuss them in sequence, okay? We are looking at it that you graduate from Usul al-Fiqh, and then you look at it at the second tier, which is now the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya before advancing to Maqasid. But in reality, they are used independently, in parallel, okay? Usually scholars use them in parallel. Of course, they are used to assess different evidence. But it's because most of the scholars that were concerned with Usul al-Fiqh and probably Qawaid were less concerned with Maqasid. Okay? Now, what these tools serve to do is to, number one, ensure that we maximize our efforts in ijtihad, in representing the prophets, and also to minimize human error as much as possible. In other words, they're just trying to serve us, helping us to represent the prophet better, particularly where we are far from the origin with history and some context might be missing. They try to help us keep faith with the origin and the intent of Sharia.
So while we look at the job of a mujtahid as being at that junction between reason and revelation and reality, we look at the process, what's going on in the head of the mujtahid for the sake of presentation. We look at it using the metaphor of, say, a processing plant, a factory where fatwa is crafted and it goes through certain stages before its final output. And Usul al-Fiqh focusing on the evidence for this fatwa before it starts its journey through another stage where it is tested for its compliance with the spirit of the Sharia, the broad general principles of Islam, and then finally going through another stage in that processing plant that tests it for compliance with the objectives, the higher intents of Sharia. As
Qawaid is more like you say quality control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like, when you produce a product in a factory, you have quality check or certification.
Excellent.
Exactly.
So, and it's interesting that these fields historically generally followed one after the other. So the early scholars after the period of, the revelation during the time of the Prophet, and then the time of the Sahaba who witnessed that, the next generation that gathered the various hadith and collections, to the next generation that started the processing and analysis of this, the generation of the early mujtahids from Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, and the field of usul al-fiqh developing. Later, the field of qawaid al-fiqhiyah developing, and each field being developed as society was changing, as scholars felt the need to improve the system through which fatwas were produced. As we know, usul al-fiqh has never been the final arbiter of fatwas. There will always be sometimes differences between the schools, but what we find happening, particularly in contemporary societies, is because the scholars benefiting from all the earlier scholars, we find actually greater unanimity in opinions when it comes to Islamic finance, when it comes to Islamic biomedical issues. It's not like times when you would find there are 9 different opinions on a particular issue or more. So while scholars will still continue to differ, we find that in the area of processing, and we see these in a lot of some of the fatwas surrounding COVID, that the taking of fatwas through these filters seems to improve the quality of fatwas as we move, and we continue to pray Allah to guide us. Part of what I'd like us to look at, Malam Ibrahim, is the relationship between usul al-fiqh and qawaid al-fiqhiyah. I would like us to also look at the relationship between qawaid and maqasid, and the relationship between maqasid and usul al-fiqh. Again, we have done this to various degrees throughout this course to try and show that these 3 work together. As you said, in the head of the scholar, they actually work in parallel. It's not actually all that lined out. But for the sake of just making this discussion easier for those who may be new to the subject, what would you say would be the relationship between usul al-fiqh and the qawaid al-fiqhiyah?
Now, as we have explained earlier, usul al-fiqh, maqasid al-shari'ah, and qawaid al-fiqhiyah are all meant to serve the texts of Quran and Sunnah, meant to serve Sharia, in trying to refine it, in trying to understand it, and in trying to help us appreciate the wisdom and practicalize it. So all are meant to make sure we represent the Prophet, we are closer to the intent of the Sharia in a way. More so, all the 3 derive their basis, or what you can call support, from Quran and Sunnah. So usul al-fiqh is not new really per se. It's by extension an offshoot from Quran and Sunnah. Qawaid al-fiqhiyya, the same thing. Maqasid al-sharia, the same thing. Now let's take the first maxim of Qawaid al-fiqhiyya, which says that al-umuru bi maqasidiha, and juxtapose how it is related to maqasid al-sharia, to usul al-fiqh really. Al-umuru bi maqasidiha here is related to illa and hikmah, particularly in qiyas.
Al-umur bi maqasidiha meaning
matters are judged according to the basis they stand to achieve, meaning based on the purposes behind them. So here it is more in line with the wisdom, where you look at, in qiyas, basically you're looking at 4 units. You're looking at the illah, okay? Basically you have aslu, the original case, and far'u, the new case. The illah, the underlying cause of a ruling, and hukum. So all of these are based on intent, purpose. Also, these rules or tools of istidlal, maslaha mursala, istihsan, saddu zari'a, and like somebody who said even fatu zari'a, they are all goal-oriented and concerned for consequences, where the most important thing there is also intent. Al-umuru bi maqasidiha. Now when we go to the second one, which is al-yaqin la yazulu bi shak, certainty is not overruled by doubt. Basically, this one is looking at the tools of assessment, particularly in things like qiyas. Also in istidlal, you're looking at how do you assess the benefits and the damage. Like when you want to do impact assessment. Similarly, when you want to look at what is the order of accepting various tools in various schools to ensure certainty and making sure they are closer to the source, they use this tool of certainty is not overruled by doubt. So you can see that these maxims are related to the tools of usul al-fiqh, and they share the same evidence. When you ask them what is the textual basis for this, is the same thing they are giving you, because they have the same line of reasoning, but they are all coming from different angles, and maybe because they were developed at different time. Then the third one is al-mashakka tajlibu ad-darar yuzal. Ad-darar yuzal basically is looking at how must be eliminated. How must be eliminated is at the bottom or basis of all the three tools of istidlal. Basically also looking at maslaha mursala, istihsan, saddu zari'a. And sometimes even you have to look at issues like ijma. Okay? Sometimes ijma is also related in a way to al-mashakka, ad-darar yuzal. So this is the relationship. So you look at usul al-fiqh on one side, share the same evidence with qawaid on the other side. Yes, sir.
Salah, what would you add to this?
I would like to touch on the last two of the five universal principles or maxims. The fourth one, which is al-mashaqqa tajlib at-taysir, which is that difficulty calls for facilitation, where the key goal there is how do you provide that concession of facilitation or ease for someone in a state of difficulty. And there are certain tools that lend themselves much more easily to achieving this particular aim. That is tools such as Fathu Dariya, which is the opening of the means, Maslaha Mursala, which is also another tool that allows the juries to consider the benefit of a particular course of action, as well as Istihsan, where there is the juristic preference. The jury is deciding that, this particular path or particular ruling shouldn't apply because it will not bring that ease or benefit, or this is the ruling that should apply because it will bring benefit. When we then look at the fifth principle, the fifth one is al-ada muhakkama. This is about respect for custom, acknowledging the strength of custom, the innate wisdom that lies in people's usages, the habits that communities have formed over time. And there are tools that support this as well, chief of which is urf itself. When you look at the tools of usul al-fiqh, and it's said that this is one way of approaching it, or istishab, where there's a legal presumption of continuity, that whatever has been still should be and should not be changed except there's an overriding interest to be served or an overriding reason.
Alhamdulillah. I would say what you have said is, if somebody were to write all the usul of fiqh on one side, make a list of the qawaid on another side, one could do a lot of combinations with just so many of them. And as you've already mentioned, you could find this principle in usul supported by this, urf connected with al-ada muhakkama, maslaha connected with mashaqqa tajlibu taysir. And let's move now to the relationship between the qawaid of fiqh, the legal maxims, and the maqasid of Sharia, the higher intents and objectives. What kind of connections do we see between the two?
Okay, again, we start from the top. We start with the first maxim, al-umuru bimaqasidiha. And in the wording of the maxim itself, we see the connection with al-maqasid al-sharia, meaning that first maxim that matters are judged based on the purposes they serve and the intention behind them is basically tied to everything that is listed as the maqasid al-sharia. So whether it's life, religion, family, justice, dignity, whatever it might be, it therefore implies that every action, every ruling, every decision, every judgment should be connected to one of those specific higher purposes or intents of the law. Secondly, we look at that same al-umuru bimaqasidiha. Matters are judged according to the purposes they fulfill and the intention behind them. To say there's also the question of the consequence. And as we've mentioned so many times, that jurists do look at the consequence. What will happen when this ruling is passed? In as much as the ruling might be the best, given the evidence that supports it, might have been done following the right steps and equations and the priorities of evidence and all of that. There's the concern for consequence embedded in that maxim, which is consequence as to what, with regard to what? With regards to the maqasid al-sharia. The second maxim, which is al-yaqinu la yazilu bishak, that certainty is not overruled by doubt. So there's a concern for what is certain, for what is true, what is solid. And when we look at the maqasid al-sharia, there is that same concern that if you say something will bring a benefit to a specific purpose or intent, you have to be sure that it will be beneficial. When we then look at the third maxim, ad-darar yuzal, harm must be eliminated. Harm in what sense? Harm to life, condition of living standards, harm to the family, harm to the individual, harm to people's sense of dignity and value. Again, the concern for ensuring that we prevent anything that would harm the achievement of the goals of Sharia. So these are some of the connections that we can easily make between some of the maxims and al-maqasid al-sharia.
Mala Ibrahim, what would you add to this?
Yeah, the fourth maxim, which is al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir, is supported by the principle of ease and facilitation, taysir. More so, one of the essence of Sharia in broad term is jalbul masalih, which is more in line with al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir also. Facilitation, ease, mercy, cooperation, and seeing how you can help people in hardship and getting relief when things are becoming difficult. Like Allah say, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha, and a number of discussions that we've done earlier regarding this issue of Islam is about taysir, taysir, taysir. So al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir is more in line with taysir, jalbul masaleh, and ease and rukhsa. Even the rukhsa, ease and licenses given in case of changing circumstance and situations are all related to this maxim. Now the fifth one, which is al-ada muhakkama, is more in line with dignity, honor, identity, cooperation, and unity, social cohesion, which are all among the intent of Sharia. You know, I remember typically when discussing this issue of unity, look at the importance Quran gave unity, so much so that there was a time Musa left his brother Harun and went to converse with Allah, or commune with Allah actually. And when the followers, the Banu Israel now, children of Israel, took to worship of calf, when Harun attempted to convince them, and he couldn't. He didn't push hard. And when Musa came, he said, Ya Haruna ma mana'aka idh ra'aytahum dallu alla tattabi'ani afa'asayta amri. Why don't you prevent them? Why don't you stop them? He said, Yabna umma la ta'khudh bi lihiyati wa la bi ra'si inni khashitu an taqula farraqta bayna bani Israel. This issue of social cohesion is what I'm trying to underscore. He said Musa held on his forelock and his beard like he was angry. Why? He said, don't do that, my brother. I was afraid of you coming back to meet the congregation split, disunited. So this issue of social cohesion, unity is among the core intent and which Al-Ada Muhakkama stand to protect, which is much more in line with the maqasid of Sharia, particularly from Quran perspective.
Again, just like between usul and qawaid, we see between qawaid and maqasid that a lot of what qawaid and the legal maxims are trying to protect, we find another concern for exactly the same things, even though coming from a separate perspective, but similar concerns in the toolbox of the maqasid sharia.
Sure.
The next and the last one I'd like us to look at is the relationship between the maqasid sharia and usul al-fiqh. What would you share there?
Yeah, maqasid sharia and usul al-fiqh. You know, you look at it, usul al-fiqh is actually in line with maqasid sharia. Because usul al-fiqh is just concerned with interpretation and understanding of sharia. Why maqasid sharia on the other side is like, okay, what does sharia seek to achieve? So the essence is texts are meant to serve an objective. So Quran and Sunnah, for instance, defend principles of promoting common good, peace and unity, harmony, ease and facilitation. All of those are supported by Quran and Sunnah. The second area is Amal and Ijma are supported by what? This principle of social cohesion, unity, cooperation. We look at Amal al-Madina and Ijma. What the people using Amal al-Madina, what are they trying to protect? Social cohesion, unity, and in fact, even continuity, what you can call presumption, like Ijma of Sahabas, Ijma of people of Medina. So trying to maintain the originality of Islam from its source. When you look at Qiyas, it's much more in line with Illah and wisdom and Hikmah and all this call to reason, to think, to ponder over as Quran invited. You look at Ra'i Sahabi also is trying to promote unity, social cohesion, and also, you know, the wisdom from the Sahabas that we believe they learned from Quran. Sahabas have gotten special position that in such a way that their views and opinions are worth considering because of their relationship with the generation of Quran. All the time Quran will say, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, they were the one. Others are by affiliation. All the instructions, the do's and don'ts and the conversations of Quran, they were directly. So that link gave them that, you know, order and weight and dignity, so much that we believe when they speak on a religious issue where it does not contradict the text, they're actually speaking based on what they were influenced by or understood from the text.
And I think also, just to add there, when one asks what are examples of Ra'i Sahaba, we usually find them identical with Maslaha, with Saddu Zariya,
Exactly.
with Istihsan. In other
Exactly.
words, there was wisdom behind them,
There
even
was
though
wisdom.
we call it Ra'i of Sahaba.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah. So these are some of the relationship we can see between Usul al-Fiqh and Maqasid al-Sharia. Because just like I say, Fiqh and Usul al-Fiqh are concerned with interpretation and understanding of the text. Why Maqasid is about, okay, what does the text seek to achieve, serve to? So they are in the same direction, really.
Excellent. And I think, you know, just back onto the same point, in a lot of this discussion, we've been quoting fatwas of Sahaba as basis, since we also view Sahaba as being more like the great mujtahids, even though in some sense you would say the Prophet also in his capacity in giving fatwa. But when it came to Sahaba, These were examples of what you call the greatest scholars of this ummah who were students of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yeah.
Salah, what would you add to this?
Yeah, I think we can look at a few more of the usul al-fiqh tools to see the connection between them and the maqasid. For instance, when we look at istishab, the presumption of continuity of the existence of those maqasid, continuity of the fact that the maqasid have always been there and they are still there. So one presumes things such as innocence of people, purity of things, justice, truth, the legal presumption that these things are there, they have weight, and they are worth protecting or promoting. Another tool we can look at, though, as we've mentioned before, it's no longer so much in use, is Shar'u man qablana. At least at one time it was used much more than it is used now. And that particular tool, which is the laws or ways of the people who came before, implying the religious communities, that there is wisdom that is passed from one generation to the next. And this wisdom is found in people's ways, the ways they've adopted in their their works, the texts they also relied on. And that ties to this idea of the pursuit of or protection of the intellect, the way one thinks, thinking to that extent. And also this dignity of people, the respect given to people who follow earlier revelations, in as much as we may have differences in certain things, but that, treating with dignity that which is of the other. A last aspect of the usul al-fiqh tools that I would like to touch on is the istidlal tools. That is Masalih al-Mursala, Istihsan, and Swadu Dariyah, and how these tools, the safety net principles, there is safety net to catch what? To catch the maqasid, to make sure that whatever errors or lapses might occur, as is human nature when jurists are doing their work, that the maqasid are not dropped, that they are caught and they still remain part of what is considered and what is weighed.
This is very interesting, and I think again, if one was to represent this diagrammatically, you would actually have either overlapping circles so that you find the principles of usul overlapping with the principles of qawaid and the principles of maqasid, or an exercise we sometimes do in our training courses would be to ask participants to list all the adilla and the sources of Sharia on one side, on another break down all the maqasid that you know, on another all the qawaid principles that you know, and see how to link them together. And what you have is this web, or sometimes, depending on the artistic flair of participants, an interesting wheel of interconnectedness between one and the other, because they share a lot of these principles, which gives a greater level of certainty that whatever principle that is important in representing the Quran and Sunnah, as practiced by the Prophet and the Sahaba, whatever principle was missed through usul would most likely be caught by qawaid. And if it wasn't caught, it would be caught by maqasid. That when these operate in synergy, the most important principles of Sharia are captured, and a fatwa goes through that filtration process to ensure the highest quality and the closest approximation of what jurists believe the Prophet would have done if he was in this context, or at least the closest representation of the Prophet ﷺ in his absence. None of these fields is a stranger to the other. They are siblings, they are triplets, if you put it that way, very interconnected, things that should be taken together as ways of maximizing certainty when it comes to ijtihad, as has already been repeated so many times by both of you and throughout this course. Each of the tools have their grounding in the opinion of scholars, in the Quran and in the Sunnah. And when you ask, what is the hujjah, an evidence for using this tool, for using qiyas, or for using maslaha, or for using istishab, you find everybody going back to Quran and Sunnah as the evidence for that. If you ask what's the evidence for any of the qawaid of fiqh, you find it going back to Quran and Sunnah. And if you ask what's the evidence for the maqasid of Sharia, the hifdud deen and protection and preservation and promotion of deen and life and justice and compassion and family and dignity, you find it going back to the Quran and the Sunnah. I'd like to stop there, but encourage participants, as we try to do ourselves, to contemplate more on this subject area, to read more about these fields, to do further research about the connection between these fields, but to not forget, most importantly, outside these, the study of reality, the study of the particular subject under question. Is it economics? Is it healthcare? Is it psychology or psychiatry? Whatever it is, these fields need the support of those scholars, those professionals of the various areas that the fatwas are going to be relevant to. And so ultimately, really, while usul, qawaid and maqasid are important, they also have to, the deliberation has to get the input or be done by the collaborative effort of the scholars of that particular field, or what some call the ayat of creation, what Allah has exposed to people of the particular fields, and also these sciences that contribute to the fatwa quality. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions and the discussions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.